Hello, everyone. I'm here to discuss some of the early 17th century in England with you and give some of the historical background of the time period. It's a very busy century. Just as the 16th century was very busy, there are different kinds of revolutions happening in the early 17th century. So, as I mentioned before, with the end of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, um, you have the end of what is kind of considered the golden age of English history. Like everything, a lot of people loved her. She was known as the Virgin Queen. She was highly celebrated, and she was known for her deft, political policy, as well as her parsimonious nature as far as handling finances, things like that. In fact, one of the things that she's really well known for, much to people like Sir Philip Sidney's chagrin, is that she kept England from entering wars on the continent. And there were many wars going on with regards to, religious preference, such as Protestants versus Catholics, and lots of different things going on. And she, kind of had an isolationist policy, if you will, of not interfering with those matters, focusing on things at home. So let's see, with the end of her reign, she dies in 1603. We have the ascension of King James I in the Stuart dynasty. So before we even talk about that, let's talk about King James I a little bit. So, for instance, you have Henry VII here. He has a son named Arthur who dies after being married to Catherine. He dies very young, dies at the age of 15. So Henry VIII takes his place as next in line with the heir. So we mentioned Mary I of England, daughter of him and Catherine Aragon. So he divorces Catherine Aragon, marries Anne Boleyn. We have Queen Elizabeth I of England. Um, Edward actually ruled before both the sisters, but we mentioned that he dies very young. And Henry had a son with Jane Seymour, and then he had two other wives. So, but on this side, Henry's sister Margaret Tudor marries James IV of Scotland, and then we see the lineage kind of makes its way downwards. And that here is Mary Queen of Scots, who was executed um, by Elizabeth for planning, for conspiracy to assassinate the Queen. She was a highly Catholic sympathizer. In fact, she actually tried to claim authority to the throne when Elizabeth was already on it. So, like, she claimed that the throne was actually rightfully hers. So, no surprise there that she rebelled. And so, interestingly enough, the successor on Elizabeth's deathbed. So, Elizabeth is the Virgin Queen, which means there's no heirs. She never married. So, the next successor that she names is from the Stuart dynasty, which she comes from. He's a distant cousin of hers, and that's James the Sixth of Scotland, who becomes James the First of England, and that's where we get James the First. So there is a connection; they're distant cousins, you know, a little bit removed, but still there. So James the First takes the throne, and he had a lot of hopes. He was a very ambitious king. So even with Elizabeth, as we see from some of her speeches, there was a traditional relationship of the king or the queen having communication with Parliament, which included the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And so Parliament, represents more the interests not associated with, associated more with the gentry or the merchant class, or even at times the commoners. And so, in fact, Parliament was largely responsible for raising taxes to support king or queens in whatever they want to do, like make war, for instance. However, when King James comes to power, he believes in what is called divine right, which means I was put here by God, so every decision I make is going to be the right one because God is directing me. Still highly Christian nation, still Protestant, but much more of a believer in divine right to a point that he stops really communicating clearly with Parliament. In fact, there were a lot of Puritan representatives in Parliament, and King James did not care for the Puritans one bit, usually. Lot, there's a lot of back and forth between what usually will become called Cavaliers and the Puritans. Cavaliers being sympathetic to the royal court culture, which is ostentatious, and King James I was very ostentatious, much of a spendthrift. He enjoyed drinking, feasting. He Elizabeth was actually very. She didn't give out many honors and titles like barons and things like that. He did. He gave out a lot to favorites, people he thought helped have helped him along the way, people he liked, and so he was a much more liberal, in a bad way, with the treasury of the nation, because well, this racked up a lot of debt. That's why I say bad. Like whereas Queen Elizabeth was very good as far as bringing the debt down, he raised it exponentially with his spendthrift ways. Um, and to top that all off, he wasn't despite believing in divine right, like zealously, writing about it, he wasn't as inspiring as Elizabeth the First. I mean, Elizabeth the First believed in divine right too, but not she didn't tout it as much as King James the First did, and he really, really believed in it. In fact, he had some lofty ambitions, like hoping to unify Ireland, Scotland, make a united kingdom, with England. That never really happened during his rule, but that was a hope that he had. Um, let's see. In fact, here, historical sources say that the court was more disorderly and wasteful. He does make a treaty with Spain. Remember, we had a skirmish with them in 1588, and there were some actual other battles going on intermittently with Spain up until 1604, where there's a peace. Other things going on this time: expeditions to America, and as I mentioned, the hostility to Puritans. Oh, in 1605, for instance, you have the gunpowder plot. So the Catholics are still trying to basically oust the Protestants from England. The gunpowder plot with Guy Fawkes, remember the 5th of November, is basically a plot to blow up King James I and a lot of the nobility, in Parliament. The plot was uncovered, conspirators were hanged, but it had the potential to basically change things drastically, and with regards to politics. And that was a Catholic conspiracy to get rid of people like King James. But during this time, we have expeditions to America. Colony of Virginia, for instance, is 1607. So those things are, when you have things like Jamestown, for instance, it's named after King James. Go figure. Let's see. What else is going on? Oh, so James, he rules from 1603 to 1625 and dies. His second son ascends as Charles the First. First son, I can't remember. I want to say his first son's name was Henry off the top of my head. Can't really remember. But the first son dies rather young. It's like 1612 when the first son dies. Of sick, gets ill and dies, and then Charles the First is the next in line, and so Charles the First ascends in 1625. In fact, Charles the First actually had a few more strengths than his father. He was more control. He was actually very efficient controlling the debts. In fact, he pays them off by the early 1630s, which is a very heavy debt. But Charles the First is actually also more aggressive in his rule. His father had instilled in him principles of this divine right, and while not a theorist in it, he did allow that to color how much of the rule he overtook. For instance, by the 1630s, he dismisses Parliament. Actually, no. By the late 1620s, he dismisses Parliament, and they're gone for like 11 years after that. Which this will eventually lead to English Civil War. It's one of the many steps because he, like his father, he wanted to rule on his own without having to consult Parliament or representatives of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Furthermore, he marries a French queen named Henrietta Maria, which is a Catholic. She's Catholic, and she tries to convert nobles to Catholicism. In fact, there was a lot of suspicion that Charles I was more sympathetic to to Catholicism, and they were afraid that it would come back. In fact, one of his appointments, again, the Puritans were part of Parliament, and one of the things that alienated them was the appointment of Bishop William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury. So William Laud, Puritan theology stresses things like grace over works, that you can only be saved by the grace of God. He chooses you. In fact, he predestines you. You are elected. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's all in God's power because God's almighty and that's how powerful he is. So grace is given, is bestowed upon you. You cannot earn it. Whereas William Laud says, in more of a Catholic vein, that, it is, that grace is freely available to all. So again, still Protestant technically, but William Laud put a lot of stress on works, like, doing, performing charity, giving things to the poor, doing good deeds, which is a very heavily Catholic idea. And so Puritans didn't like that. They weren't very happy with that. In fact, one of the campaigns that Charles I tried to do was to spread his religious ideology to Scotland, which was highly Catholic. And this leads to what is known as the Bishops' Wars, which were unsuccessful. In fact, once they were unsuccessful, it's around 1639, 1640 that Charles I has to call back Parliament, be like, "Hey guys, I need money. You need to raise taxes for me," because that was Parliament's job. The king could not do that himself. It would be seen as tyranny if he did, and so he needs Parliament, even though he doesn't want Parliament. A lot of political strings. They make other demands, though. They try to make other demands for more representation of their own voices. They actually have people like William Laud arrested. Um, they relax censorship of the press. Before this time, there were offices of the government representing the king, like the Master of Revels, for instance, or the Stationer's Registry, that would censor seditious material. Those get loosened entirely, and there's more kind of political engagement in the newspapers than had ever been before at this point. Damn that printing press! It gives a lot of people more, more access to have their voice heard, and that causes a lot of problems for people like Charles I. In fact, in one way, it probably cost him his life. So when we talk about the Caroline era, Caroline is basically a Latinization of Charles. So we're talking about Charles I. So 1625 to 1640, very artistic, chivalric, hyperbolic. It was a very festive culture at court. Celebrations of festive culture that Puritans damned as sinful and deriving from pagan worship. There was things like mass going on. Celebration of the theater was still happening. Shakespeare. Excuse me. Shakespeare's death occurs in 1616. So 400th anniversary of that has already passed this year. And but there were other playwrights performing. In fact, one of the reasons I don't include a play from Shakespeare here is I want to showcase some of the other plays from contemporary playwrights of his, such as John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi, which is 16 teens. But there were other plays going on. Ben Jonson, for instance, was a well-known playwright. Unfortunately, we're not gonna have time to read him per se, but and part of that was all associated with courtly culture, as far as an ostentatious, dramatic. In fact, the Puritans would damn things like the theater. If you ever seen Shakespeare in Love, for instance, there's a Puritan outside saying this is an immoral, sinful place. It was thought that prostitutes and thieves frequented there, so it was a haunting grounds for, devilry, basically. And so they damned it as immoral. In fact, they would successfully shut down the playhouses in 1642 during the English Civil War, which we're going to get to in a moment. But before that, there is a culture war. In fact, there's a Puritan guy named William Prynne, for instance, who in 1632, 1,000-page tirade gets plays, court masques, maypoles, which were all part of English heritage. But some of it was seen as being tied to Catholic heritage, that ostentatiousness that Puritans hated in Catholic culture, they saw going on in English culture. And so there's kind of a cultural divide between Anglicans, between Cavaliers and the Puritans. I mean, they're both part of the Anglican Church. Puritans and Cavaliers are both part of the Anglican Church. The Puritans sought to purify the Anglican Church. So William Prynne prints this, but he gets imprisoned for life, stripped of degrees and profession, books burned, and ears cut off. A little bit extreme. So again, you can't really there wasn't as much free speech. Not until the Long Parliament, which had not occurred by this point. In fact, it's interesting. John Milton, who we're going to read, one of considered a very prominent English poet, was a Puritan. He was a supporter of the Commonwealth, that comes, the Puritan Commonwealth that comes out following the English Civil War. In fact, he barely escapes execution when the Restoration happens. But for a Puritan, he was very free thinking for the most part. He did not. He repudiated both courtly aesthetics and wholesale prohibitions. He actually spoke against censorship, which even in the Puritan sects was happening as well. It wasn't just a king thing that got kings didn't just censor what they saw as disagreeable. Puritans did too. John Milton was a little bit more free thinking, except he could not stand Catholics. There was no sympathy for Catholics from him. Whereas a man like Roger Williams, there was. Other things are happening too as far as change is concerned. Literature and culture is changing. So the universe prior to this point has been seen as there's something called the Great Chain of Being, which is a Christian ideology which basically says everything has a place and an order. And that's one of the main reasons that feudalism survives so long, is that this idea is that you are put in this place for a reason. God has put you here. To try to change that is going to be, kind of sacrilegious. You know, animals, insects, plants, they all have their place in the great chain of being, and that's static, it's stable, it should not be changed. However, new ideas are starting to emerge. In fact, the beginnings of the scientific revolution are happening. In the 16th century, we actually had Copernicus, who basically proposes a heliocentric model where the sun is the center of the universe. It was just a theory that he had, that the Earth was not the center, which had long been believed. In fact, at the bottom of this slide, it says Galileo confirms Copernican. When we think of Galileo, why he's so famous, it's because he was able to confirm that the theory is correct. He tested it, it was correct, and he made the argument that we do indeed live in a heliocentric universe, which was very unsettling for those of faith, because it suggested that we were not the center of everything, that mankind was not the center of everything, which is why, if you know the history of Galileo, he ended up recanting what he said because the Catholic Church put a lot of pressure on him to recant it. They basically threatened him to not endorse. But he's not alone. Galileo wasn't alone during this century. Francis Bacon, for instance, is known as an advocate for inductive reasoning, which basically means that you come to conclusions through, and perhaps you hear about this in the sciences because it's still practiced today, that you start with an hypothesis and then you perform the test to reach a conclusion. So you work up to the conclusion, you don't start from a conclusion and work down. In fact, a lot of times the opposite of inductive reasoning is deductive reasoning, and sometimes when you do that, which was long practiced before this point for centuries, it's called basically a confirmation bias, that the conclusion is correct, how do we prove it's correct? But that's not, and for those of you in biology and the other sciences, that's not how it works. You observe the world in front of you, and then you work up to a conclusion based on the facts and evidences in front, or through empirical experiments like Bacon advocated here. But one of the things that's also new is the discovery of blood circulation, challenges ideas about the humors. And some of the Renaissance literature that we're about to read, like Dr. Faustus, you'll see lots of allusions to the humors, like yellow bile, black bile. If you're sanguine, in fact, one of the major practices during this time was if you were sick, it was an imbalance of the humors, and so they would do bloodletting, to let it out. So, and there's various things associated, like yellow bile associated with phlegm. Or if you're sanguine, for instance, you might be hot-tempered because there's an imbalance in the humors. Or if one particular bile is out of order, you would be melancholic. So, like, your emotions were influenced by your humors is kind of the idea of it. It's very fascinating to read about, but that was getting challenged by things like William Harvey's discovery. Alright, and then we move to the Revolutionary era. So, like, where we last left off, we talked about Charles I's kind of butting heads with the gentry class, with Parliament. And part of that, it's not just a change in belief systems. The belief systems are also influenced by a change in modes of economy. Like capitalist modes of the gentry were starting to become more incompatible with feudal norms. So, like, the gentry, would come into money. Before this time, money and nobility and recognition was based on land ownership. and that's starting to rapidly change in a more market-driven economy. So, like, more trading, more commercial business. That's part of the reason we went to the New World in the first place. For tobacco and other items like that. For um, raccoon, raccoon hats. The skin of the fur of raccoons, things like that were getting traded. And that leads to wealth, which leads to a new class of power that is basically challenging the old feudal norms, which is based on land ownership within the country, which we talked about before. So this leads to the clash of the Long Parliament. Parliament's called back for the first time in 11 years. They're not going to be happy about that. And they try to make demands. They want more of a voice with the king, and, with King Charles, who wanted to raise taxes. In fact, King Charles just wanted them to raise taxes and go home, but they were not having any of that. In fact, they wanted, he dismissed them before without their consent. And so they were trying to get actual assurance that they decide when they're dismissed. They wanted a share of power, or they wanted to basically have some kind of influence. King Charles didn't want that at all. And so there's a kind of a back and forth until, King Charles has enough at one point and tries to arrest 5 members of Parliament for treason. But Londoners take the side of Parliament and take up arms against that arrest, and the king is forced to flee to a different city, York in this case. And then Parliament in 1642 raises its own army, and then we have a civil war. We have, sympathizers with Parliament, mostly Puritan sects. And not to say that Puritans were uniquely united. There were different sects. There was Presbyterians. There was, a lot of different. Let's see. You had Congregationalists, Independents, Baptists, Separatists. So, and all with various definitions of how it should have. Separatists, for instance, thought there should be a separation of church and state. Whereas, or Presbyterians want a national Presbyterian church with dissenters punished and silenced as before. So, everybody wants their own kind of various brand. But Puritans in general, they didn't have any wish to depose the king. They just wanted more rights. So there was, and that will be instrumental when we get to the Restoration. So they didn't want to depose the king, but they felt like they had no choice but to, stand up for their right, for their liberties. And look, we've come full circle. So during the Civil War, there's a lot of vandalism in the churches by Puritans who saw the church as too ostentatious and, full of things that are distracting from God. They wanted to purify it. If you remember the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, it sounds a lot like that. So again, we've come full circle. Let's see. By 1648, the war has raged on, but the king's army eventually gets defeated, and the king is in prison. But of course, he's not happy about it. He tries to continually escape. So the king's in prison in 1648. 1649, they cut off Charles I's head. Yeah, that's a big deal. Historically, I don't really know of any king who was turned on by his own people like that. In fact, it's kind of hypocritical that a lot of Englishmen, nearly a little over a century after this, express horror at the fact that the French will execute their king in following the Revolution of 1789, when the English kind of did it first. They execute Charles I, they behead him. It was met with mixed reactions. Some people were appalled. Some people thought it was the right thing to do. So, very confusing time. So, and then there begins what is usually known as the interregnum, which there's the founding of a republic by the House of Commons. By 1653, the leader of the army, the leader of the army of Parliament, Oliver Cromwell, becomes Lord Protector in 1653. And he had done, in fact, during this time too, he had done campaigns in Ireland and Scotland. They took a lot of joy in massacring a lot of Irish because they were Catholic. In fact, there's a lot of taint on people like Cromwell because of the massacres that he enacted. So let's see, Cromwell dies in 1658, and then Charles II, who is son to Charles I, gets recalled from exile, and this marks the beginning of the Restoration period. In fact, we'll talk more about the Restoration period, when we get there. So like it's usually around 1660 that we mark the Restoration period, um, where Charles II, where the monarchy is reinstalled, reestablished, and that kind of skirmish is over. Let's see, one more slide. Um, I've actually already kind of covered these things a little bit. So yeah, that was some of the culture of the time. So if you have any questions about the history, feel free to contact me, and that'll be it for now.